and the planes just disappeared.
It's one of the enduring mysteries in U.S. military lore. The disappearance of Flight 19 in the Bermuda Triangle.
14 men died initially, 13 more in the search party.
It was December 5th, 1945. 5 Navy Avenger torpedo bombers took off from a naval air station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, an area that's come to be known as the Bermuda Triangle.
When I was a kid, Close Encounters of the Third Kind absolutely terrified me and intrigued me. Every time I rode past a long row of mailboxes, I thought they'd start shaking all over the ground, and then a great beam would come down and sunburn the side of my face. This film introduced me to aliens, but it also introduced me to the great Jeep Wagoneer. No, not that Wagoneer. That Wagoneer. Oh God, I love that car. And the film, even to this day, gets that catchy tune stuck in my head. Oh yeah, I won't forget that. But another thing it introduced me into was Flight 19. Now, let's take a dive and learn about Flight 19. First, Flight 19 was a designation given to 5 General Motors TBM Avenger torpedo bombers on a routine navigation and bombing practice mission. They were headed at a naval air station, Fort Lauderdale. It was December 5th, 1945. There were 14 crew members on 5 planes. The leader of Flight 19 was United States Navy Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor. He had 2,500 flying hours accredited to him in the same type of aircraft. His trainee pilots had 300 total hours and 600 total hours on the General Motors TBM Avengers. Lieutenant Taylor had recently completed a tour in the Pacific. He was a bomber on the aircraft carrier USS Hancock. He had just arrived from Naval Air Station Miami. He was a VTB torpedo bombing instructor pilot. The other student pilots had completed other training missions in the same area where the flight was going to take place. The other training pilots were U.S. Marine Captains Edward Joseph Powers and George William Stivers, U.S. Marine Second Lieutenant Forrest James Gerber, and U.S. Navy Ensign Joseph Tipton Bossy. The aircraft were 3 TBM-1C, numbers 45714, call sign FT3, 46325, FT81, 73209, FT117. There was 1 TBM-1E, number 46094, FT36, and 1 TBM-3, number 23307, FT38. All of the aircraft were a version of the Grumman TBF Avenger built by General Motors. Each aircraft had a full tank of gas. During the pre-flight checks, all of the aircraft were discovered to have their clocks missing. But the facts that the clocks were missing did not stop the practice mission. It was assumed that each man had his own watch. The purpose of this mission was a bombing practice mission, as well as teaching dead reckoning. This involved calculating elapsed time along with a number of other things. The pilots and crew of Flight 19. In FT-28, Charles Taylor, pilot, crew George Devlin and Walter Perpart. In FT-36, E.J. Powers, pilot, crew Hal Thompson and George Payonessa. In FT-3, Joseph Bossy, pilot, crew Herman Thalander and Bert Balak. In FT-113, George Stivers, pilot, crew Robert Grubel and Robert Galvan. In FT-81, Forrest Gerber, pilot, crew William Lightfoot. The planes were supposed to take off from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale at 1:45 p.m., but it was delayed until 2:10 p.m. The weather was described as, quote, favorable, sea state, moderate to rough. Lieutenant Taylor was supervising the mission. One of the trainee pilots had the role of leader out front. This flight was headed right to the Bermuda Triangle. It wasn't called the Bermuda Triangle when the men were about to head off on their training exercise. That started at around 1950. The Bermuda Triangle is known as an area in the North Atlantic that has a larger than average number of missing aircraft and ships that have either crashed or just went missing in it. But many believe the number is not very unique or very mysterious. Their mission would involve 3 destinations. Their fourth would be the return back to Fort Lauderdale after reaching the Florida coast. After takeoff, they flew on heading 091 degrees, basically due east, for 56 nautical miles, until they reached Hens and Chicken Shoals, which is also known as Chicken Rocks. Once they reached Chicken Rocks, they would start an exercise in low-level bombing practice. After the exercise, they would continue on heading 091 degrees for another 67 nautical miles. From there, they would turn on a course of 346 degrees and fly for 73 nautical miles. During this, they would fly over the Grand Bahamas. After 73 nautical miles, they would turn on a heading of 241 degrees and fly 120 nautical miles until they reached the Florida coast. They would turn left and return to the Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale. That was the plan, but you know, if you're watching this video, that didn't happen. This is the mystery of Flight 19, not the standard practice mission and safe return of Flight 19. The radio transmissions between pilots were overheard by the base and other aircraft in the area. The practice bombing mission is known to have been a success because after 3 p.m., one of the pilots requested permission over the radio to drop his last bomb, and permission was granted. 40 minutes later, a different flight instructor, Lieutenant Robert F. Cox, in FT-74, was gathering his students for a very similar bombing practice mission in the exact same area. He received an unidentified transmission. An unidentified crew member asked Powers, who was one of the students, for his compass reading. Powers answered, "I don't know where we are. We must have gotten lost after that turn." Lieutenant Cox sent the transmission. "This is FT-74, plane or boat, calling Powers. Please identify yourself so someone can help you." The response he got after a few moments was from the others in the flight asking for suggestions. Lieutenant Cox tried again, and a man identified as FT-28 Taylor came on. "FT-28, this is FT-74, what is your trouble?" Taylor replied, "Both of my compasses are out and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I am over land, but it's broken. I am sure I am in the Keys, but I don't know how far down and I don't know how far to get to Fort Lauderdale." Lieutenant Cox informed the Naval Air Station that aircraft were lost. Then he advised Taylor to put the sun on his port wing and fly north up the coast to Fort Lauderdale. Base operations then asked if the flight leader aircraft was equipped with a standard YG, or Identify Friend or Foe transmitter. They could use this to triangulate the flight's position, but the message was not acknowledged by Taylor and FT-28. Later on, he did radio that his transmitter was activated. At 4:45 p.m., FT-28 radioed, "We are heading 030 degrees for 45 minutes. Then we will fly north to make sure we are not over the Gulf of Mexico." The IFF transmitter could not be picked up at all during this time. Taylor was told to broadcast on 4805 kHz. He did not acknowledge this order, so he was asked to switch to 3000 kHz, which was the search and rescue frequency. Taylor replied, "I cannot switch frequencies. I must keep my planes intact." At 4:56 p.m., they asked Taylor again to turn on his transmitter if he had one. He did not acknowledge. A few minutes later, Taylor advised his flight, "Change course to 090 degrees for 10 minutes. This course is due east." Around the same time of this transmission, someone in his flight said this, "Damn it, if we could just fly west, we could get home. We need to head west, damn it." This transmission caused a lot of questions later about why the students didn't just head west on their own. But this is the attitude of military discipline. You're not just going to leave your buddies and fly off back to Florida by yourself and leave everybody else out in the Atlantic Ocean. It's just not going to happen. The weather started to deteriorate at this point. Radio transmissions became intermittent. It is believed that the 5 aircraft were more than 200 nautical miles out to sea, east of the Florida Peninsula at this point. Taylor radioed, "We'll fly 270 degrees west until landfall or running out of gas." He also requested a weather check at 5:24 p.m. At 5:50 p.m., several land-based radio stations had triangulated Flight 19's position, as with being 100 nautical miles of 29 degrees north, 79 degrees west. This is directly east of New Smyrna Beach. Flight 19 was way north of the Bahamas and well off the coast of Florida. At 6:04 p.m., Taylor radioed to his flight. Holding 270, we didn't fly far enough east. We may as well just turn around and fly east again. By 6 o'clock, the weather had deteriorated even worse and the sun had set. At 6:20 p.m., the final message was heard from Taylor, but other reports also say that at 7:04 p.m. was Taylor's last message. Regardless, this is the last message that was heard. All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. No other radio transmissions were heard. Air bases, aircraft, and merchant ships were also alerted. Flight 19 was lost. A consolidated PBY Catalina departed at 6 p.m. to search for Flight 19 and guide them back if they were located. 2 Martin PBM Mariner flying boats, who were originally scheduled for their own training missions, were diverted to perform square pattern searches in the area of 29 degrees north, 79 degrees west. Navy Squadron Training Number 49 PDM-5 BU number 59225 took off at 7:27 p.m. It took off from Naval Air Station Banana River. It called in a routine radio message at 7:30. And then it was never heard from again. At 9:15 p.m., the SS tanker Gaines Mills reported and observed flames from an explosion leaping 100 feet high and burning for 10 minutes at position 28.59 degrees north, 80.25 degrees west. Captain Stanley reported an unsuccessful search for survivors through a pool of oil and aviation gasoline. The carrier USS Solomons also reported losing radar contact with an aircraft at the same position at the same time. The crew of the PBM-5 were Walter Jeffrey, pilot, and crew members Harry Cohn, Roger Allen, Lloyd Eliason, Charles Arsenex, Robert Cameron, Wiley Cargill Sr., James Jordan, John Menendez, Philip Neenan, James Osterheld, Donald Peterson, and Alfred Zywicki. A 500-page Navy Board of Investigations report was published a few months after the vanishing of Flight 19. This report stated a number of things, including: it is believed Flight Leader Taylor mistakenly believed that the small islands he passed were over the Florida Keys, and that his flight was over the Gulf of Mexico and heading northeast would take them to Florida. They determined Taylor passed over the Bahamas as scheduled, and he did lead his flight northeast over the Atlantic. This report said that the subordinate officers did likely know their approximate position, as they indicated on the radio transmission stating that flying west would result in reaching the mainland. The report stated that Taylor refused to change the training radio frequency to search and rescue frequency. The training frequency was difficult to use because of interference with Cuban radio stations and also a radio carrier wave. Taylor was not at fault because the compass stopped working. The loss of PBM-5 59225 was attributed to an explosion. The report was amended, cause unknown, by the Navy, after Taylor's mother said the Navy was unfairly blaming her son for the loss of 5 aircraft and 14 men, when the Navy had neither bodies nor the airplanes as evidence. If Flight 19 was where Taylor believed it to be, the flight would have made landfall within 20 minutes on the Florida coastline. A later reconstruction showed that the islands visible to Taylor were most likely the Bahamas, well northeast of the Florida Keys, and that Flight 19 was exactly where it was supposed to be in the first place. The investigation found that because of Taylor's belief that he was on base course towards Florida, he actually guided the flight farther northeast and out to sea. It is general knowledge that if a pilot ever became lost to fly a heading of 270 degrees, another rule of thumb was that any pilot who got lost going south would turn his plane around with the sun on his port side and then follow the Florida coast, heading north. By the time the flight actually turned west, they were so far out to sea that they didn't have enough fuel. This, along with bad weather, meant that there was little hope of rescue even if they even managed to stay afloat. They believed it was possible that Taylor overshot Gorda Cay and instead found Abaco Islands. He continued on and expected to find Grand Bahama. Instead, he could have seen a landmass on his right, the northern part of Abaco. He could have believed it was the Grand Bahamas. With his compass malfunctioning, he set a course to what he thought was southwest, to head straight back to Fort Lauderdale. Instead, he could have gone farther northwest, towards the open ocean. He encountered a series of islands which made him even more confused, which he believed were Key West. The control tower suggested that Taylor's team fly west, which would have taken them to Florida eventually. Taylor could have traveled to what he thought was west, but was northwest, almost parallel to Florida. After flying for a while with no land in sight, he decided it was impossible for them to fly so far without reaching Florida. He believed he might be near the Florida Keys. Taylor was not sure if he was near the Bahamas or Key West. After a conversation with his crew and the control tower, he was not sure which direction he faced because of his compass's malfunction. Some of the crew believed that their compass was working. Taylor set a course northeast according to the compass, which should have taken them to Florida if they were in Key West. That failed. Taylor set a course west according to their compass, which should have taken them to Florida if they were in the Bahamas. If Taylor had stayed on that course, he would have reached the land before he ran out of fuel. However, he decided that he had tried going west far enough, and he once again set a northeastern course, thinking they were in Key West after all. Finally, the flight ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean somewhere north of Abaco Island, but east of Florida. Now back to where this story started. In 1977, Close Encounters of the Third Kind brought renewed interest into Flight 19. The film's opening scene showed Flight 19 in the Sonoran Desert in pristine condition, full of fuel, having not aged a day. The crew was missing, but the engines fired right up. And the closing scene, having the survivors of Flight 19 walk off the spaceship along with Little Barry. A great movie, but do I really believe aliens are the cause of Flight 19's disappearance? I do not. They ran out of fuel, bad decisions were made, and they ended up in the Atlantic, somewhere off the coast of Florida. Yes, the Bermuda Triangle gets a bad rap, and yes, there have been a ton of missing aircraft and boats in the area, along with a number of different stories of compasses malfunctioning and odd occurrences happening in the area. A lot of pilots have thought they've gone 5 miles and they've really gone 100. Something is definitely going on, but I don't necessarily believe it's paranormal. But who am I? I'm nobody. I think Taylor just got confused. He didn't know exactly where he was. He kept thinking he was going west when he was really going northwest, or how could he possibly believe that he was in Key West? That's all the way down on the other side of Florida. I mean, a great distance. I mean, they're up flying by the Bahamas. It kind of boggles the mind. I think this was just a big accident. I don't necessarily think it was anything paranormal, but who am I? I am nobody, like I said. It's a fascinating story nonetheless, and I hope y'all enjoyed, and I hope you learned something. I definitely did. I've always been fascinated with the disappearance of Flight 19, and I definitely learned a lot more today. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you on the next. Peace.